Hey guys, how's it going? KRIPP'S here. Today I want to give you guys my updated, and now that I've leveled to 100 on a Firewall Sorc guide. It has been a pleasure to play Firewall. It is one of my favorite skills. It is incredibly dynamic because Firewall falls in between damage over time skills where it is a reoccurring damage over time skill, but it also has the snapshotting property because of the second upgrade that pushes its damage over the next 3 seconds even if they leave Firewall. This allows you to have very dynamic gameplay explained in a previous video with damage over time mechanics if you really want to get in the details of it. Here, just a little bit of gameplay for one of my leveling sessions. This is level appropriate content. I'm doing just a regular dungeon on World Tier 4, and you can see the build in action. You can use Firewall by just dropping it and walking the mobs through it, which is very suitable for low health mobs. But when you have powerful mobs in your way, you want to try to snapshot the damage using crowd control. You want to use your Frost Nova as frequently as possible. You want to use your teleport as frequently as possible. And while there isn't a whole lot of content to do in Diablo 4 after you level, this is a fantastic leveling character. Even though I don't have anywhere near the experience of a lot of other players, as this was my first character through the game, I was actually beating even the groups to level 50 just by putting Firewall in front of me and running through it. On World Difficulty 1, that is a fantastic way to play that cannot be beaten inefficiently, it seems. Inefficiency, I mean. And for the higher level content, it is still a pretty good build. The fire build, I believe, doesn't have quite the damage of ice shards, but it's still really close, and it doesn't quite have the damage of the arc lash build that procs ball lightnings, but it's still pretty close to that one. But what it does have is an incredibly defensive toolkit that some people can't really realize at first glance. Yes, the other Sorc builds can do a little bit more damage, but we're talking 10-20% here. We're not talking double or triple. The peak damage of this character is I've done like Firewall ticks of about 600,000. So this is pretty powerful because Firewall, the damage over time mechanics actually tick twice a second. So doing over 1 million DPS solo on a Sorc, that's considered pretty good. So let's get into the character here. What are we dealing with? Well, the reason why other Sorcs can do a little bit more damage is because they have other stats that increase their damage significantly on gear. So if we look at this ring, we have life, critical damage, vulnerable damage, and damage to stun. Now the damage to stun, that's a pretty minor thing for all the builds that I mentioned, but the other builds that I mentioned also scale from lucky hit in many cases. This one you want a little bit, and they also scale from critical chance. This character only scales critical damage, not critical chance, because we have the, where is it here? Burning Instinct. We actually get 310% burning damage, which is the equivalent of like 2 glyphs, by the way, 2 fully leveled glyphs, because we take our critical damage on our gear and we get burning damage from it. It's important to know that the burning damage is not converted to burning damage. You still have the crit multiplier, so when it comes to impact damage from your meteor, which is one of the enchantments that you want, well, your meteor can crit for a crap load of damage, as it turns out. And of course we use the Firewall enchantment. The Firewall enchantment is one of the strongest enchantments on Sorc because it just adds so much damage and it cascades when you have lots of mobs. Firewall is a skill that just hits lots of targets. Yes, it does a little bit less damage than like ice shards, but ice shards is hitting a lot fewer targets, for example. A proc in Diablo 4 cannot proc itself, so while Firewall regularly procs the X pattern firewalls for 3 seconds, it will never have the X firewall proc another X firewall. A meteor proc will never proc another meteor proc, but everything else can be procced. So we have a case where we're using 2 proc effects, and while none of them really happen with incredibly high regularity, because they're both large AoE skills and they have their chance to proc for each target hit by them, Well, that changes things up. And the meteor can proc Firewall because it has a damage over time component where the meteor lands, and the Firewall can proc meteor because even though the skill doesn't hit, Firewall has a lucky hit component. Skills don't have to hit to have a lucky hit component. So we proc the meteor with Firewall, and even Teleport does a great job of proccing meteor, and the character functions quite well as you were seeing in the gameplay. In terms of the damage stacking stats, there's not a whole lot after crit damage and vulnerable damage that we want, which comes to our rings, it comes to our weapons, it comes to our gloves. This is why the build does a little bit less damage. It has way more burning damage than like a ice shard build would have, like cold damage or core skill damage, which is all additive, by the way. So it has a lot more than that, but because it doesn't scale crit with critical strike and actual critical damage, because Firewall cannot crit, the damage ceiling is a little bit lower. The reason this is by far the tankiest Sorc build is because you don't need crit and you don't really need lucky hit chance. So you get life on your rings, so you get defensive stats all out on your pants, on your helmet, on your gloves. You can even get some other defensive stats, like you can get just all stats on your boots, for example. You don't have to get like the mana mod. You can get plus defensive skills on your amulet because the other stats are not as highly contested. This does mean that you do a little bit less damage as a ceiling, but it also means that you have like 16,000 life and you can scale armor. Now, the other builds, they can do that as well. The thing is, if the other builds cut back on critical chance and lucky hit modifiers and mana modifiers, they are no longer going to be doing more damage than Firewall. And this is kind of the beauty of the 4-stat system they have on items in Diablo 4, where you really do have to make these decisions. And an effective cold build will never be tankier than an effective Firewall build. And an effective lightning build, and lightning has critical damage with lightning as an extra stat, it usually won't be tankier than a cold build, and it'll never be tankier than a Firewall build, unless you decide to play that and do less damage because of a playstyle choice, which, you know, do what you want. In terms of the character overall, we are looking for generally defensive stats, but we're also looking for crowd control duration. Crowd control duration is a ridiculously powerful affix, and I will explain. So we have crowd control duration on the helmet. We have crowd control duration through the Exploiter's legendary power. We want to put this on our boots. There's no other damage thing that we can use on our boots, so that is very good. We can also get crowd control duration on the amulet, but the amulet is really highly contested for stats, so that can be a difficult thing to do. And we can get crowd control duration on the offhand as well. And this results combined with some incredible investment in defensive skills. Level 12 Frost Nova lasts 9.2 seconds. And because we have the crowd control duration, it lasts for 4 seconds. But wait, there's more. One of the most powerful legendary powers on Sorc and even some other classes is Smiting. Smiting, you have 20 increased critical strike chance against injured enemies. Injured enemies have 35% or less health. But you also gain 40 crowd control duration multiplier. So my Frost Nova, if I'm healthy, and I'm always healthy because I'm chaining barriers, lasts about 6 seconds and has a 9-second cooldown that is reduced by 1 second when I kill a frozen enemy. So I am actually able to permanently freeze most monsters. I am almost always able to permanently stun most monsters because we're using the teleport chest. And again, I have heavy cooldown reduction, and teleport is, I think, like a 5-second teleport because the 20% is added afterwards, where that some effects only happen when you're in the world, not in town. And we have the teleport upgrade. The cooldown is reduced by 0.5 seconds per enemy hit, up to 3 seconds. And the gameplay is stack a bunch of stuff in a general area where you can teleport into, pull them all on the exact same spot, put a firewall exactly on that spot. So the same firewall is ticking on 10, 20, 30 monsters. It's going to be proccing meteors like crazy. It's going to be proccing firewalls like crazy. The meteors proccing more firewalls. And those targets are permanently locked in place because we're scaling the crowd control duration. This build is also extremely tanky. Just to go through the skills real quick, we'll go back to items in a second. I use Arc Lash because we can take out Meteor and put in Arc Lash when we use a bunch of cooldowns on a boss to stagger him. The stagger is based on crowd control duration, and this character is able to stagger any boss within about 3 teleports and 2 novas. So about 9 seconds, I will stagger any boss. 3 teleports, 2 novas, the boss is staggered, and staggered bosses are affected by all crowd control, so our damage is quadrupled from the aspect of control and other abilities, and the boss just melts. That's when we do millions of DPS with Firewall. But you never really use your base skill. In terms of the core skill, you can use Devastation 3. The reason you might want to use Devastation 3 instead of Potent Warding 3 is because resists are currently awful, and if those are addressed, obviously you'd flip those around. We don't really gain benefit from a higher mana pool, other than Inferno with the last upgrade makes the Pyromancy skills cost no mana. Usually when you're pressing this button, and it has a pretty low cooldown if you invest in cooldown reduction, at the end of the 8 seconds, we are going to have a full mana bar. And if that full mana bar has an extra 6 mana on it, maybe we can cast another Firewall. There's not really much to it there. Cooldown reduction is super important for this build because teleport is ridiculous. We want to chain stun everything all the time. We want to chain freeze everything all the time. And it's just crazy. We also gain our mana recovery from cooldown use. You can get this from a dungeon, the 15 mana, so that is pretty good. That's how we recover our mana and are able to chain firewalls non-stop. I don't spec in Glass Cannon. I have 1 point from the unique chest, but this is a preference. You don't have to spec in Flame Shield if you have a plus defensive skill amulet or if you have the skill on your boots. Plus defensive skills on amulet is basically a must-have. On an amulet, you're looking for plus defensive skills +2 and cooldown reduction. Nothing else really comes close to those 2 stats. Giving you 3 skills on teleport is more damage, more cooldown reduction. Frost Nova is more freeze, but it also means that you're getting much higher vulnerable uptime on bosses, so it's a huge damage increase for that. Plus skills lets you drop the 3 points in Flame Shield. It is a preference though. I actually really like the Flame Shield that heals me for half my life every time I use it. But if you want, you can drop those 3 points and put it into Glass Cannon for more damage. Now, it might seem like gaining 6 damage and taking 3 more damage per point is not super good, but if you really study the game and the affix weights and all that, it's actually easier to get damage mitigation than it is to get damage. It's kind of the opposite of Path of Exile. There's not a lot of multipliers for damage in Diablo 4. So if you were like, deal 20% more damage, take 20% more damage, in Path of Exile, that's awful. But in Diablo 4, that's actually pretty good. So Glass Cannon is actually pretty good. Obviously, it's not pretty good if you're doing content where you're going to get one-shotted rather than, well, not getting one-shotted. So there are some breakpoints that you might want to consider there. Get the question all the time, how do you use Ice Armor if you don't spec in Ice Armor? Well, the second upgrade is not very good, and that's 2 points that I'm saving. 1 point if I don't want to get it. It's all right. Mana Shield is not super good, but it does help. You can have 3 points in it. If you don't have the teleport chest, you can not get 5 points in teleport. You definitely want to get 5 points in Frost Nova, no matter what, though. Any build, any Sorc, if it doesn't have 5 points in Frost Nova, click away. It is not a good build. Align the elements, I think you want at least 2 points. I see a lot of builds with 1 point in align the elements. Align the elements no longer works with like the shielded hits, so anytime you get hit, unless you have an immunity up, it will go down against elite monsters, but it's very powerful otherwise. The barriers are ridiculous. You can get barrier generation as a stat on gear, but it actually does not work with this. Now, I don't know why it doesn't. It works with Ice Armor. But Ice Armor has like a massive barrier anyway, doesn't really matter too much. So yeah, but we want to get a lot of life, and this is why the build excels. In Diablo 4, you can't have barrier that is higher than your total life. So this build, even though it gets a lot more life, a lot more defensive stats than the other Sorc builds, it also results in having even more survivability. The survivability cascades into the barrier system, and barriers also function as recovery. So this Sorc also has the high highest regeneration of all Sorc builds. So it's very, very cool in that sense. We use Meteor really only for the immobilize effect. I would use Meteor in my enchantment slot, even if it did like no damage at all, because the immobilize from the second upgrade, it triggers the aspect of control for the third condition. We have stunned from the teleport, frozen from the frost nova, and Meteor proc, which actually happens very regularly with the stack up unique chest mechanic. You don't need the unique chest, but it's a good idea to build around it if you happen to get one in the end game. And the immobilize is another 50% multiplier. It's another a trigger for potential stagger on the boss, and it does help with damage. And because we are stacking lots of critical damage to convert into the damage over time through Burning Instinct, remember, the smiting aspect gives me 20 critical strike chance against injured. That actually does start to play. My crit against injured with Meteor, and Meteor sometimes happens a bit delayed, is about 40%. And I have the near maximum amount of crit damage on this Sorc. People ask me all the time, well, then if you're scaling crit damage, why don't you use Devouring Blaze? Devouring Blaze is a multiplier on your crits. Devouring Blaze is not critical damage. It does not work with Burning Instinct. It is really good for a crit-based build, and even though we use some mechanics from crits, we don't use enough that it's worth the 3 points. Obviously, we max Firewall. As a personal preference, I really like barriers having increased duration because we have a lot of conditions based on barriers. Damage if barrier, damage to vulnerable if we have a barrier, and barriers is really crazy. So I very much like that. Originally, I thought to use the Deep Freeze skill, but the pulling in effect of Inferno and the fact that it solves a lot of mana problems, I slowly moved away from Deep Freeze. I think Deep Freeze is still a decent option and might be a better option if content is really brutal, because it's a long immunity and because we scale cooldown reduction, and it has the other cooldowns. It's very powerful. I don't think it's a mistake to go with Deep Freeze, but if you are using Deep Freeze, I suggest you at least try Inferno and see if you like it more. Some mana regen doesn't really matter. Endless Pyre, it's a 15 multi the longer that they're burning. And Warmth is ridiculous. So we heal for 1% of life for each burning enemy. And because we pull them all together and they're crowd controlled the whole time, they're not actually hitting you back. So if some mob hits you for like 90% of your life before you crowd control the entire room forever, you don't have to use a potion. You're going to get that life back in like 2 seconds if there's like 30 mobs, because they're all burning and they're all nearby. So Warmth is completely insane with this build. Most of our defensive layers have to do with the barriers, but if the damage goes through the barriers, we are going to recover that back. I have face tanked Butcher in incredibly dangerous Nightmare Sigils 25 levels over my character. So keep that in mind. For the ultimate passive, I do recommend that you use Combustion for the most part. Don't ask me how it works. I don't know how it works. I throw firewalls, damage go up. Okay, damage go up. I think a unique source of burning is like another application of a skill. I think 5 firewalls is 5 sources of burning. And I think procs and meteors and all that is more sources of burning. So I think combustion is actually really good. It's just that once you reach a certain level of cooldown reduction and a certain level of power against the mobs that you're typically up against, Shatter starts to be really good, because if you're doing like Nightmare Dungeons, for example, you're going to have the thing where you kill the white mobs in like half a second, but some of the rares, if they have like Suppressor or some really dangerous affixes, well, it's going to take you quite a lot longer to finish them off, even with the damage boost of Combustion. So I really like Shatter because it is just a faster clear if you have like a complete character, which, well, thankfully I do now. We are level 100. We have Paragons. I have gone through the Paragon system more than you can imagine. If you want the details on Paragon, it will be in the description below. For the general build, it will be, as always, on Mobalytics. That's right. But they are getting their Paragon system going. Not quite yet, though, so I'll just give you guys a full link if you want the Paragon information. It'll be further in the description. Don't ask me where it is. That's where it is. But again, for all crit builds, Mobalytics. All right. So I like to put the Mastery Glyph here. They actually nerfed glyphs a few days into the game across the board, and some glyphs far more than others, and this does affect our decisions in where they go. So some of these glyphs are in a new position, some of the glyphs I don't scale as much as before. Generally, what was nerfed is the scaling modifier. The implicit bonus thing, those I don't think were changed at all. I like an int glyph in the starting board, even though there are boards with 75 int. Well, it's just like, it's like 10% mastery damage. The mastery damage is all additive with Burning Instinct. So if we lose a little bit, it's just not that big a deal, It's not a big a deal. So I like it in the starting board because the int nodes are really efficient. So you go here. You want to get this anyway. So for a 1 pointer, we'll take 10. And then we want to go here because we want to get that, and we want to go here because we want to take that. There's almost no wasted points to obtain 70 int. Even though we can get 75 on another board, that board is going to have several wasted points to get the 75. So I really like the int requirement in this board for Sorc. I move into Burning Instinct. You shouldn't get Burning Instinct right away unless you have items with critical damage when you're leveling, and that can be not easy to get. It's a pretty rare stat, and stats in general are pretty bad early on. I would, however, get Safeguard. Safeguard is completely insane, and I would get the burning damage stuff up here. This glyph won't even work until you can get, actually no, I think this one might. A lot of glyphs don't work until level 15. The glyph system's kind of a mess. So don't worry about the glyphs too much. Early on, you're just picking up some rare nodes until you get to the 60s, maybe 70s, and you actually start running some Nightmare Sigils. So I have Exploit in here. This is vulnerable damage. This is effectively a multiplier. It's not 30% more damage because my vulnerable damage is 300 almost or something. So, but it's still a multiplier. It's still a good bit of damage. No one's getting as much power from glyphs as they were before. But thankfully for the Firewall build, and the reason why I actually stayed with a Firewall build is because they nerfed the glyphs. Almost all other builds were affected more than Firewall. Firewall was nerfed 5%. Ice Shards and Arc Lash were nerfed 40%. So that's not a small deal. I like to go to Enchantment Master next. Sometimes you might actually go through here just to get Enchantment Master as fast as possible. Enchantment Master will massively upgrade your AoE clear because you're getting more meteors and you're getting more firewalls, and more of both means you're getting more crossover as well. So Enchantment Master is super fantastic. The glyph for it is the worst one, but these points I feel help early on. 20 non-physical damage when you have 50 is an insane amount of damage. So these nodes early on are pretty good. So you want to go that way, and the leveling for this build works out pretty well. We eventually move into the vulnerable board. I forget what it's called. It's based on Frigid Fate. Yeah, we don't get that though. Most of these things suck. Basically this node. It's really good. We amplify it with Tactician, 125% bonus to all nodes within range. Keep in mind, Tactician is giving us almost as much vulnerable damage as the vulnerable damage glyph. Now, admittedly, I only have 39 dexterity on this, but if we look at how much one dexterity point gives, it's 5 dexterity and 4 vulnerable damage with a maxed out glyph. If I want vulnerable damage, I can just get 5 vulnerable damage there. So again, you have to kind of change the nuance of, the details of your strategy with post-nerf Paragon boards. And eventually I go into the control glyph. Again, I don't scale the dexterity like crazy. Look how efficient this is. We go here because we want the critical strike damage. This will improve. The damage that we deal with Burning Instinct, because this effectively is as it shows up on your gear. The bonus is only fire damage, so I don't even care about the bonus. 10 fire damage is nothing. And this one again, fire resist, who cares? But we get the end, and look how efficient it is. We go there, so we can get damage reduction with burning. We get the crit damage. We get a glyph that 100 damage to crowd control, and the bonus 20 multiplier to stunned and 20 multiplier to frozen. Ridiculous glyph, because we are doing those on every single pack that we pull, and just incredible efficiency here. So the Paragon system has changed quite a bit since release, and you guys can take a look at that later. For final just gear review here, a lot of stats don't really do too much, but we want a little bit of lucky hit on the character, because just to kind of get those meteors going, you don't need to stack lucky hit or anything like that. I'd rather go for defensive stats. Until it's changed, percent armor is your best defensive stat. Percent armor scales linearly. And the more you have, the better it is, because if you have like 50% armor and you gain 5% armor, that's actually 10% mitigation. So 10% armor for this Sorc gives me 15% physical mitigation and like 8% elemental mitigation. So it's kind of ridiculous. Firewall is also fantastic at scaling the armor aspect. So we always have 100 stacks with Firewall. Ice Shards is not going to be doing that as easily, and it's not going to be doing that when mobs are like spawning in. Like you can have a pretty similar amount of damage reduced from burning. Where is it here? Damage reduced from burning. 54. You can still get 54 damage from burning on the Ice Shards build, on the Arc Lash build, but if you have to like engage the monsters to have that. If you're playing Firewall, you just have fire all over the room. Okay, so stuff is burning, and that is kind of an extra, you know, experience-based defensive layer that the other Sorc builds will not have. Plus teleport, plus Frost Nova. I really like the attacks reduce evades cooldown by 1.2, because when you suck monsters in with a teleport, you usually can't move your character, but the dodge goes through mobs. So this lets you just constantly dodge. I think this is the best one, but you know, there's some preference when it comes to that. Smiting is really important, trying to get a good roll. One of the best glyphs in the game, especially for Sorc. I think it's the best glyph, the best legendary power for Sorc. I have vulnerable if barrier because they disabled edge masters. I actually have another offhand I was using, but the stats are pretty similar. There's basically a few damage based ones. Just pick the ones that you like. Like, I like the one to stand still. I don't think I have one in the guide because most people don't realize how to actually use this. You literally have to stop moving for like 3, 4, or 5 seconds, and then the bonus starts to activate, because most damage over time effects from Firewall are snapshotted. So yes, that is a little bit of a mess. You need the mana cooldown, damage if barrier, and you always want to have the aspect of control on your amulet. If you're using a two-hander, you want to have it on your two-hander, but generally you don't want to use a two-hander. The reason you use one-handers is crowd control duration, absolutely crazy. Cooldown reduction, but there's two stats. The implicit for offhands is cooldown reduction, and you get it as a stat. There's not a lot of cooldown reduction in general. If you don't have an offhand, your cooldown reduction is going to be like maximum, like 20-something. But we have 41.5 cooldown reduction, and that is massive because Teleport and Frost Nova both have flat numerical, you know, refunds on your cooldowns. So if you have like a 5-second teleport and you're getting refunded 3 seconds, right? So you basically have a 2-second teleport. But if you have a 6-second teleport and you're getting refunded 3 seconds, you have a 3-second teleport, which is 50% longer cooldown. Just 1 second difference, but it's 50% longer. And it certainly feels much worse. So even though I would level with two-hand, I would level with Firewall, I would level with the playstyle of putting the Firewall in front of you, running the mobs through it. That is pretty low DPS, but it's high efficiency because you're always moving. When you get closer to the end game, closer to the higher levels, when you are able to roll some items and you get a good offhand, it's time to use one-handers. People ask me, well, it gives you higher attack speed. What does attack speed do for Firewall? Well, you get some on your gloves too. Well, you just cast more Firewalls. Yes, the damage is lower, but you cast more of them. So the damage is basically the same, but it's actually a little bit higher because the flat startup for casting starts with non-damaging skills. So the way you have to think about it is like, if you can kill the pack and like Frost Nova Firewall, you're not just casting the Firewall faster, you're casting the Frost Nova faster. A lot of the defensive skills are instant, but Frost Nova, not instant. Okay. So that's the character. I have had a blast playing it. Level 100, it is complete. The way that I see it is Sorcerer as a class is fantastic. It's very well balanced because we have, you know, the different spectrum of tankiness, damage, and the group ability in the middle and the solo play on the sides. It's really cool, and I hope you guys learned a lot from this video. And as always, we will see you in the next.